This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
Additional support provided by
Get to know Proximity Malt. We malt superior, European-style, low-protein varieties grown close to home in Delaware and Colorado. Domestically grown, precisely malted to style. With our team of seasoned experts and 2 brand new malt houses, try what's really new in malt. Check us out at www.proximitymalt.com.
This is just a really cool new technology that brewers want to understand. The fact that it doesn't produce THP, it's very neutral. It produces consistent lactic acid at a consistent period of time.
This week on the show, bioengineered lactic acid producing Saccharomyces cerevisiae.
Hi, my name is Molly. I'm with Lallemand Brewing. I'm the East Coast technical representative.
Hi, my name is Eric Abbott. I'm the Global Technical Advisor for Lallemand Brewing and Technical Sales Manager for Canada.
Hi, I'm Chaz Rice. I'm a research scientist at Mascoma LLC, which is affiliated with Lallemand as a corporate R&D facility.
You've released a very interesting product that brewers can use to produce clean sour beers. Tell us what that is and how this project came about.
So Sourvisiae came about, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. We started working on developing some bioengineered brewing yeast, just kind of playing around. Mascoma mainly does biofuel-related projects, but since we became integrated with Lallemand back in 2014, we've kind of slowly, tried to apply our expertise to other markets, other business units within Lallemand. And the brewing group very quickly was interested in, just sort of dabbling and seeing what we could do, what we could offer, knowing that, at the time there wasn't a lot of GMO products out into the industry. So, we started kind of working on some various projects. And, one of the things that we quickly started working on was kind of flavors. We sort of thought if we're going to get into the market, maybe we need to start thinking about, something that's a little bit more kind of in your face, something that a consumer can taste, a brewer can utilize very easily to improve their process. So, we actually had sort of a kind of brainstorming session, and we had a person at Mascoma, Brooks, who was kind of in the sour beers, and he suggested, we could probably make a yeast that makes lactic acid. And we all kind of yeah, that's a good idea. And then, within the year, we just started doing it, and we started making it, and then started making beer with it and, giving it to people, and people, kind of hit you over the head with that sour flavor. And people thought, hey, this is actually interesting. And it just kind of coincided with this sour boom that was going on in the craft industry. So we started, the brewing group was interested in kind of doing some trials with it. And so that's kind of how it all materialized. It was literally just kind of, a little brainstorm session, and someone had a good idea, and we just sort of applied it into the lab.
Very cool. So now there are already some sac yeast that are capable of producing lactic acid, but my understanding is that most of, or maybe all of those, come with other downsides. Is that why you ended up engineering this strain?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We tried to look at the sort of the pros and cons of the products that are already out there, and between sort of wild fermentations, between kettle souring, they all have their own pros and cons in terms of, kind of creating unique flavor profiles. Whether you're looking for something from a wild yeast, for example, or something from a bacteria, they're going to produce other metabolites that add flavor. But I think the one thing we sort of noticed, or we sort of put the pieces of the puzzle together, is that, one of the things that's very difficult to do with wild ferms is get consistent product. And oftentimes you don't get the sort of level of sourness that you might want for a certain style. So that's where we looked at Sourvisiae and engineering this ale yeast that, produces pretty high levels of lactic. So you get a more controllable sort of lactic concentration, perceived sourness, but you also get cleaner flavors if that's what you're going for. So, Saccharomyces, Lachantia, Lactobacillus, they all make, decent levels of lactic acid, but they also make all these other metabolites that add to flavors, as has been well noted. So I think for what we were targeting, we were looking for, that kind of clean sour that enables brewers a lot more flexibility in their brewing process.
What can you tell us about the genetic modification that was engineered?
Yeah, it's it's a very simple modification. We essentially just introduced one gene, which is a lactate dehydrogenase gene from a food microorganism. And so this is a microbe that is used commonly in pickling and fermentation-based products. So we basically took that gene and introduced it into our brewing strain, which is a typical ale yeast. And it's just one single gene, one single modification under the strength of a pretty strong promoter. The promoter is basically what kind of drives expression of this gene. So it kind of controls how much of this protein that you get. And the lactate dehydrogenase essentially converts one of the intermediates in glycolysis and converts it into lactic acid. So it kind of directly competes with ethanol. So that's one of the things we've noticed with the product is you get kind of a slight drop in ethanol that goes towards the lactic. But it's a very simple pathway. I mean, it wasn't a lot of over engineering. It was literally just this one gene.
And was this done using CRISPR-Cas9 or some other technology?
Yeah, it was not with CRISPR. We do have CRISPR in-house here. We tend to only need to use it if it's more of a complicated organism to engineer. Mascoma has been working with yeast for quite some time, and we have these other methods that are just as robust in terms of engineering a yeast strain. So we actually just use kind of normal yeast homologous recombination, which is basically a method in which you introduce sequences that have kind of similarities to each other, and the yeast will essentially stitch them together. And if you put enough similarity to a chromosomal location, it'll actually take that sequence and integrate it into the chromosome as well. So it's a pretty common technique that's used in the industry for years. The CRISPR is definitely a nice tool, and it enables you to like I said, engineer some strains that aren't very good at this homologous recombination. But the nice thing about a yeast is that they're very simple to engineer. So for this product in particular, we didn't actually have to use that tool.
If you recall from episode 84, we heard from Charles Denby, who engineered Brewers yeast to produce hop compounds like linalool and geraniol. I remember that it was one thing for him to splice in the genes from mint and basil to produce those compounds, but an entirely different animal to modulate the production of those compounds to the desired level. Was modulation of lactic acid production a challenge for you during this project?
Yeah, that's a good question. When we first started, we definitely took that one gene, the LDH, and we screened a few others as well. The one that we picked always seemed to function well in our background in terms of sometimes when you overexpress kind of heterologous proteins or foreign proteins, yeast don't tend to love that so much. And so you kind of take a hit in other areas where maybe the yeast doesn't grow as well, doesn't ferment at the same rate as, say, the parent did. So we kind of screened through those and picked an LDH that, the yeast didn't mind making. And then for there, we basically expressed it with a number of different promoters. So the promoters, as I mentioned earlier, will kind of, modulate the expression of a gene. And so if you use a really strong one, you basically make a lot of this LDH, and therefore you make a lot of lactic acid. So we had kind of a range of different promoters that we had tried. And this was the Sourvisiae we ended up choosing was one of the higher end in terms of making a lot of lactic. And we decided to go with the strain initially as a proof of concept, thinking that, it gives brewers more flexibility in what they can do with it. So instead of having a strain that produces a little bit of sour, maybe more in line with kind of what a wild yeast might make, we sort of thought, well, that already exists. There's a wild yeast out there that, makes this level of lactic. We wanted to provide something that gave brewers a little bit more flexibility. So we decided to go with the higher end that, enables brewers to then take it and do blending if they like, do co-culturing. And they know that they're going to get sort of a very high level right off the bat. And so it gives them the ability to sort of modulate the lactic levels.
Cool. Yeah, let's talk about that more, because your press release mentioned that the level of acidity produced by Sourvisiae is easily controlled either by blending the yeast with another strain or alternatively by blending the final beer. Can you give us some guidelines for this? How much acidity can we expect without blending, and how much blending do you recommend when mild acidity is desired?
So without blending, we have seen the pH pretty much drop out. The lowest we've kind of seen is 2.8, but it generally is around 3.1, with TA levels around 1.2. So it pretty regularly just straight Sourvisiae will produce around 12 grams per milliliter. Is that right, Chaz? Lactic?
It's grams per liter.
Grams per liter. Yeah, I was thinking grams per liter, and then kind of going, wait, that doesn't sound right. So yeah, that's pretty consistent. With blending, it just depends. We do recommend blending versus co-pitching. Just co-pitching could be kind of difficult to evaluate when to get the pH to where you want it, or the TA level to where you want it to be. So with blending, it just, that's kind of up to brewer's preference. I don't mind it straight. I think the straight Sourvisiae just tastes really clean and really wonderful. And it's really interesting to have it with different fruit additions as well. So I know there's some breweries that are they're analyzing the beer with the different types of fruit acids, and that creates a really nice, complex, and really balanced, from what I've tasted, beer.
So are most people using it straight rather than pitching a blend or blending the final beer?
I think most people are using it straight. There are some that are blending. It kind of just depends what they want. The ones that I have had have been mostly straight. It's just straight Sourvisiae, yeah.
Coming up.
It's very interesting that it makes no THP, which you see a lot in kettle sour beers.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Support for this podcast is brought to you by
ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery and parts outfitter. From our Raleigh headquarters to our Denver office, we proudly offer brewhouses and fermenters from 3 barrels and up, yeast brinks, boilers, kegs, chillers, tri-clamp, and other stainless parts, all with the quickest delivery and lead times in the industry. Learn more at abs-commercial.com or call 877-BREW-ABS. ABS Commercial. We are brewers.
Additional support provided by
Bring the world to your brewhouse with BSG's diverse selection of ingredients and services. Our dedicated customer service team and industry experience provides you with the assistance you need every step of the way. Make BSG your supplier of choice with products essential to making great artisanal beverages so you can stay focused on your craft. Visit us at bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact us at 1-800-374-2739.
Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. District Rocky Mountain meets at Breckenridge Brewery in Littleton, November 12th. District St. Paul, Minneapolis meets at the Rar Malting Bierstube, November 14th. District Milwaukee meets at Milwaukee Brewing Company, November 21st. District St. Louis meets November 21st. District Northern California meets at Sudwork Brewing in Davis, November 21st. District Midwest meets at Great Lakes Brewing, November 23rd. District Eastern Canada meets in Montreal, November 28th, and the District St. Louis annual holiday party is December 6th. Check out the full calendar of events at MBAA.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. Do you guys want to talk about how parameters like fermentation temperature, pitch rate, wort aeration, etc. might affect lactic acid production in Sourvisiae beers?
One way you can think about it is that the lactic is sort of directly related to the alcohol, right? Because as you know, we've talked about the lactic dehydrogenase is lactate LDH is comes off of the glycolysis pathway, which is where ethanol comes from. So you know, you're really, the parameters are more set based on your sort of sugar contents, your kind of starting wort gravity. So, you know, more or less, you know, just like any other process parameter, you know, how much alcohol you get is more about the starting sugars versus aeration or pitch rate.
Okay, that makes sense. And let's talk about that a little bit more too, because the Sourvisiae press release mentions that the amount of residual sugar in the finished beer is lower than the final density would imply. Talk about that.
So I can take that one. So basically, the sugar in the wort is being converted into both ethanol and lactic acid. Some of the sugar that would have normally been converted into ethanol and CO2 in a regular normal fermentation, some of that sugar is being diverted into lactic acid. And when lactic acid is produced, no CO2 is lost. So because there's not a corresponding loss of mass related to CO2 loss, when the lactic acid is produced, the density stays the same. So if you have a higher final density when using Sourvisiae compared to a normal brewing yeast, that doesn't necessarily imply that there's a higher amount of residual sugar. The sugar might be just as low as it would have been with a regular brewing yeast fermentation, but instead of the sugar being converted into CO2, resulting in a loss of density, it's converted into lactic acid.
All right, got it. In Lallemand does not recommend repitching this yeast. Why is that?
It's just the sheer amount of lactic acid that's produced. It makes it pretty difficult to repitch. From what we have seen in the trials. That being said, there are some breweries out there that are able to prop this yeast up so as to extend, instead of extending the generational life cycle, you're extending the biomass of it.
Yeah, so in terms of repitching, just keep in mind the levels of lactic acid that are produced by Sourvisiae are quite high. A lot of lower to mid-range sour beers are between 0.2 and 0.5 or up to 0.6% lactic acid. Sourvisiae will produce above 1% lactic acid. So while you can use it straight, it is a quite sour beer, and that acid does become a stress to the yeast when you get to those high levels. And at that point, it becomes dependent on the wort, the nutrition of your wort, and whether that the yeast will be viable for repitch or not. Generally, from very extreme beers, whether it's high gravity, high alcohol, highly bitter beers, we don't necessarily recommend repitching or reusing that yeast. It's the same case for Sourvisiae.
Let's hear about some of the trials you've done with commercial brewers.
Yeah, so we did 12 different brewery trials between small to medium to large size breweries. The smallest trial was about 1 barrel. The largest was about just up to 60 barrels. And many different types of beer, from Gozas to Pilsners, to Berliners. I think we had a New England style in there, an IPA style. And on average, the final TA that we saw was around 1.2%, and the final pH was around 3.1, with over 80% attenuation. And all the breweries, they found that it performed really well. And one of the things that Cigar City, which was one of the early trialers, noticed, Wayne, in fact, noticed this. He said that it's surprising, well, not surprising, but it's very interesting that it makes no THP, which you see a lot in kettle sour beers. So this goes back to it tastes really clean. It's a very neutral strain because of this lack of this production of this compound. And yeah, there were no other off flavors were detected. It's a pretty fast fermenter. So, fermentation, it's complete in around 7 days. Yeah.
There have been some questions about the role of crystal malts limiting the perception of acidity. Talk about that.
Sourvisiae produces a very consistent quantity of lactic acid, but your perception of the flavor of that lactic acid depends on the other flavors in the beer, whether it's fruit flavors or sugar. If you use a lot of crystal malt, or if the mash temperature is higher and you have a lot more body in the beer, you will tend to have a lower perceived flavor of the lactic acid, even though the concentration of lactic acid is relatively consistent.
Does the exclusive production of lactic acid during primary fermentation lend to a different perception of a sour beer than either a kettle sour or a more traditionally soured beer?
So Sourvisiae will produce a single product, lactic acid, whereas kettle sour using bacteria, it's a more complex metabolism. So other products will be produced as well, and that could be dependent on temperature as well. For brewers that are not able to control well the fermentation of their kettle sour, you may have off flavors if the temperature deviates into a range that is not optimal for the bacteria. For example, having some phenolic characters that we've seen being produced at suboptimal temperatures. Sourvisiae is not sensitive to those temperature changes as well. Over a much broader temperature range, you will produce only a single lactic acid product, leading to a very clean, neutral, sour flavor compared to a kettle sour.
I think that as for sure the perceived sourness is going to be different compared to a kettle sour versus a Sourvisiae sour. I mean, for one, with kettle souring, your pH doesn't tend to drop quite as low as a Sourvisiae fermentation will, and so obviously there's a balance of pH and lactic acid concentrations. The lower the pH, the more acidic things will taste. So I think from the trials, that's one thing we definitely noted is a lot of people were doing kettle souring, getting their pHs to around 3.5, 4.0. But then if they added some fruits to it, then that tartness tended to go away, because I think the sugar sort of masked a little bit of the sourness. So, what they liked about the Sourvisiae is that the pH dropped even further, and it gave them a little more flexibility for adjuncts to blend in without losing too much of that tartness. So it gave them the ability to kind of control that tartness a little bit. And the clean flavor was another aspect that we talked about with the THP in particular, was noted by a number of trials kettle souring lactobacillus can make this compound in small quantities, and that was oftentimes a problem for some of their kettle sours, where they would get that Cheerio cereal type flavor in some beers that they could sometimes get rid of with aging, but other times not. And Sourvisiae yeast don't typically make this compound, so this enabled them to get that drop in pH, the lactic acid production, to get the high tartness without any of the off flavor metabolites that you often get with lactobacillus. And but more importantly, it gave them the ability to then control the tartness with some adjuncts that they could add in, with either dry hopping or fruit additions, or blending with a sort of a non-sour beer as well. That was a big way to kind of control the tartness as well.
The acceptance of GMO has been a polarizing topic among consumers, whereas the community of brewers is more science-oriented and therefore more accepting. On episode 84, Charles Denby suggested that perhaps brewers are the best people to be educating consumers about the benefits of this technology. I guess you're banking on that as well, huh?
Yeah, I would actually agree with that comment. I think brewers are, the craft industry in particular, are constantly experimenting, right? So they're essentially playing science on a daily basis. So when they get sort of a new tool like Sourvisiae or any sort of bioengineered yeast, they immediately get excited. It gives them another thing to be able to try and to experiment with, and to try to pull levers throughout the brewing process. So and I think they've continued to push the limits of flavors and creativity. So, and based on the boom in the craft industry and in the consumer perception, they're not afraid to try anything, right? I mean, I think craft brewers are just really trying to have a little bit of shock and awe on some of their products. When you're using pig heads and elephant fermented coffee beans, and doing barrel aging and all these different, trying to incorporate all these different flavor profiles, and the consumers aren't afraid to try them. I think that sort of points towards bioengineered. I think from a non-GMO perspective, that I don't think there's any, at least we haven't seen a negative impact from the consumer side. So I think, as Charles had mentioned, in terms of, the brewers using these bioengineered products and educating the consumer, I would absolutely agree with that, because for they're just not afraid to use it. I think that's the biggest thing when it comes to it, is that there's more of a negative perception from a marketing standpoint.
So in terms of the acceptance of bioengineered yeast in the brewing industry, I've seen a huge difference even compared to 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I don't think that some brewers were open to it, but I don't think we would have seen such widespread acceptance of this type of technology. In the end, this is another tool in the brewer's toolbox that responds to some clear needs for the brewer related to simplicity, consistency, and saving production time, which in the end is saving money for the brewers. I think the acceptance of this type of technology is really driven by the fact that it's responding to some basic needs that are important to brewers.
That was Molly Browning, Eric Abbott, and Chaz Rice of Lallemand Brewing here on the Master Brewers Podcast. Check out the brand new Master Brewers Podcast website. You'll find guest profiles, information about upcoming live events, and more, all at masterbrewerspodcast.com. Are you enjoying the Master Brewers Podcast? Let me tell you about a simple way you can help us keep making more. Take a minute to thank our sponsors. There's no way we could produce this show without generous support from sponsors like Hopsteiner, ABS, Proximity Malt, and BSG. So please, let them know you heard their message on the Master Brewers Podcast and that you appreciate their support.